I have been around people that I wondered if they were at all really like me. I remember Dr. Feinberg at Talbot. He was just such a spiritual, different kind of person. I don't know if I would ever say I was like him or he could understand what I was like or we were on the same plane, really. To be clear, I am not different than any one of you. I'm a lot worse than you. I'm only here by the grace of God. This morning we're going to be talking about this should have never happened. This should have never happened. I couldn't help but think of an example when I was growing up. My parents had a 65 Pontiac Catalina station wagon. What I thought was a fabulous idea was to rev it up in neutral and drop it into low to make the wheels squeal. I did that a few times. And apparently there's a selector pin in the transmission. And that sheared off. And I remember my father was driving us to school, and as he's going down the road, it's just making a whirling sound. Well, something's wrong with the transmission. You boys drove it last night. Well, it wasn't doing this when we drove. They took it into Pete's transmission, and the guy repaired it. We had the brilliant idea, well, now that it's all new, it should be able to do it really well. We did it again a couple times and broke the pin again. And they took it into the repair shop, and this is what he said: this shouldn't have happened. I can see the pin is the way a pin should be. It's not a defective pin. I don't know how this happened, but looking at the evidence, it should not have happened. He replaced it. We did it again. We were squealing the tires. They actually had one of the Pontiac technicians from the plant come down and look, what is going on with this transmission that is shearing the pin? Finally, the third time, we figured, we can't do this anymore. They're going to catch us. Each time we heard this shouldn't have happened, looking at the evidence. The pin still looks perfectly good. There's no explanation for why it sheared off. We are looking this morning at the arrest, the conviction, the crucifixion of Jesus. My point to you this morning is this should have never happened. This should have never happened. And I'm glad that it got printed out for you. The notes got printed out in a bigger paper that you can keep track of. When some fallen angel is whispering in your ear that you are wasting your time believing Jesus and you need to believe in yourself, or you're confronted with a particular challenge, or you're going through a hard time, you need to remember some of these evidences that I'm going to give you this morning. Jesus should have never been arrested. Jesus should have never have gone through the trial to begin with, and any trial that he did go through was completely invalid. He should have been acquitted at that trial. Considering the legal process that happened, considering the events, there was no basis for him to have gone to the cross. It should have never happened. Let me give you some evidence this morning. The arrest and conviction of Jesus was illegal for many reasons. It should have never happened. In Matthew 26, Jesus has had the Last Supper with his disciples. He's gone to the garden to pray. His disciples go to sleep. And then, verse 47, there's a large crowd. There's a large crowd that suddenly descends upon these disciples who were sleeping and are barely awake. They come and find Jesus in the garden, and they are armed with swords and clubs. They are like the personal guard for the temple. While Judas and one of the 12 came up, accompanied by a large crowd with swords and clubs who came from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now, he who was betraying Jesus gave them a sign. The one whom I kiss, he is the one. Seize him. Now, immediately Judas went up to Jesus and said, Hail, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, Friend, do what you have come for. And then they came and they laid hands on Jesus and they seized him. There are many points that we're going to see this morning that are exactly like our law. That's where they came from. We have these parts of our law because they were parts of Jewish law and Roman law. Now, the first point is, under the Jewish law, you couldn't arrest somebody and then try to find a reason. You couldn't arrest somebody and then try to find a reason. You had to have a specific charge, then you could go and contain that person. Much like you might see on TV shows or in the movies, you'll have the police officer or whoever come to you and say, I'm arresting you for the murder of, I'm arresting you for, they have to tell you this is your specific charge. Now that kind of makes sense. If you're going to take me to court and say, let's go through your bank accounts, let's go through as many witnesses as we can find, let's see if we can come up with a reason to punish you. We would say, well, that's not fair. This is where it comes from. Under Roman law and under the Jewish law, you had to have a charge. And then you can do the investigation and then you can do the arrest. We see in John chapter 18, when they arrested him, and this was a large rabble of people, they took him to the father-in-law of the high priest, a private place for him to be interrogated privately. That was in violation of the Jewish law. They wanted things to be out in the open, to be public, no secret meetings, so you can have witnesses, so you can have a defense. So the fact that they took Jesus to Annas' house for him to have a private interrogation, that also violated law. We might think if we had attorneys like we have today, they might say this whole thing is now thrown out because of a technicality. Not because you haven't obeyed every little part of the law so this guilty person goes free. Here we're talking about you're going through a process that has no validity. You shouldn't be doing any of this. A private examination. You have to do your examinations in public so that you can have witnesses and a defense. Number 3, the Sanhedrin can't meet at night because it needs to be public so people can hear the evidence. People can be part of the discussion. But again, Matthew chapter 26, verse 57, they are taking him from Annas' house. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered. They didn't even get all the elders. They didn't even get all the people who could be able to vote. This is a very interesting point, isn't it? In our culture, we're very, very insistent that everyone should be able to vote. But on the arrest and the conviction of Jesus, they made sure that they only had the ones who were going to vote, who they knew were going to vote to convict Jesus. It was invalid. And they did it at night. You can't have a meeting at night. It has to be public. It has to be during the daytime. There was no formal charge for the interrogation. Verse 59. They were trying to come up with a reason. They couldn't even get the witnesses to agree. Finally, now the chief priest and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony. They were just trying to get people to come in and lie, come up with a reason why they were able to arrest and detain Jesus. They didn't find any. They finally got 2 people to say, well, he said, I'm going to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it. Oh, see, this guy's a danger to the public. Well, there's a further problem. Number 5, this is now according to the Jewish law, you can't have a court hearing before the Sabbath. You cannot have a court hearing. You have to have enough time for the court procedure to actually take place. This is in the Mishnah. You're supposed to leave enough time for all of this to take place. So the fact that they arrested Jesus in an invalid way, the fact that they're convening an invalid court, and the fact that they're even trying to convene a court on an invalid date. You can't have the court assemble before a holiday. Number 6, why is this so? Because you can't have a one-day trial. You could have a one-day trial if you're anticipating this person is innocent. Okay, we had the trial, there was evidence, he's innocent, we got it done in one day. Why do you need 2 days? Because if the person is guilty, you're supposed to go home and think about it. You have the opportunity for witnesses to come and give you more evidence. You have time to come back to another meeting the next day, hear more testimony perhaps, take another vote. Well, they couldn't do that because the next day was a holy day. They couldn't reconvene the Sanhedrin. So they were planning on a one-day trial. And in fact, they did have a one-day trial with a guilty verdict, and they didn't have a follow-up reconsider day. That made it invalid. 26 verse 63, they're not getting anywhere with their interrogation. They can't come up with any reason to detain or convict Jesus of anything. And just think about that. If he was such a danger, if he was leading people astray, you would think that there would have been witnesses. They can't come up with anybody who says, yeah, I heard him say these crazy things. Finally, verse 63, the high priest says, I adjure you by the living God, you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Well, there's a problem. Much like our courts, in the Jewish courts, you cannot ask a person to testify against themselves. This was an invalid question. Also, there's some question here as to whether the high priest can be the one doing the interrogation. According to the Jewish law, you're supposed to have like a defense attorney. There was nobody there doing that. There was just the high priest trying to find some reason to get rid of Jesus. And for him to ask Jesus a question so that he will incriminate himself, according to the law, any testimony given by the accused is invalid. Whatever Jesus might say in response to that question is invalid. Well, Jesus does make a response. Jesus said, you have said it yourself. You're the one testifying, Caiaphas. Nevertheless, I will tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming on clouds of heaven. That's not a blasphemous statement. There's nothing there that blasphemes God. So if that's the basis for the verdict, that's not a blasphemous statement about God. But that's immediately what is declared. You've heard it yourself, he blasphemes. Well, no, he really didn't. Number 9, there was no defense. There was supposed to be one of the elders, one of the people of the Sanhedrin, acting as Jesus' defense person. Nobody did that. That also made it invalid. He needed to have somebody who was able to argue his case. In fact, they called no witnesses. Now, there had to be witnesses other than his own statement. You can't take the statement that he made himself. So they didn't have any witnesses that said anything incriminating. The only incriminating so-called evidence is what Jesus said. That's not admissible. And then we see Caiaphas then tears his robes. That's also a violation. The high priest is not supposed to influence the voting. He has blasphemed. What further evidence do we need? You've heard his testimony. What do you think? Well, they all said he deserves death. Well, there's two problems here. First, The voting was supposed to be, in a capital case, from youngest to oldest. The youngest person in the Sanhedrin would vote first so that they're not influenced by more respected people. They're making up their own mind. In this case, you have the high priest saying, here's my opinion, what do you think? That makes it invalid. He is stating his opinion, and of course, if you're a junior member of the Sanhedrin, you're immediately put in a position of, well, the high priest has already stated his opinion. How do I go against that? His trial was illegal. It was in Caiaphas' house. First he went to Annas' house, now he's in Caiaphas' house so they could have the select few voting. Again, it was supposed to be in a public place. Number 14 is really funny. According to the Jewish law, you could only have respected leaders, authorized leaders, worthy leaders in the Sanhedrin. They had kind of a maxim that they would say, the robe of an unworthy leader is to be no more respected than the blanket that goes on your donkey. The robe of an unworthy leader is to be no more respected than the blanket that goes on a donkey. Hey, we have that in our politics today, don't we? Here's the problem. Many of these people in the Sanhedrin bought their position. Many of the people in the Sanhedrin were given their position specifically because they were going along with Caiaphas. They were going to be, his people. They weren't worthy members. They weren't elected because of their spiritual nature. And in fact, these were the people who had bribed Judas. They were, of course, very biased. They weren't going to listen as impartial judges. So you have unfair, biased judges who have bribed Judas for the betrayal and who really shouldn't be sitting in the council anyway. And then the accusation that they bring before Pilate wasn't that, hey, this guy says he's going to tear down the temple. This guy says he's coming to clouds in glory. Luke chapter 23, what is it that they tell Pilate? Hey, we want you to execute this guy because he's a bad guy. Pilate says, what are you talking about? They said, well, if he wasn't guilty, we wouldn't be bringing him here. They said, look, he's misleading people, forbidding people to pay taxes to Caesar, and says that he himself is a king. Wait a minute, we didn't hear any of that when he was in the Sanhedrin. You didn't say anything about taxes in the Sanhedrin. So they accuse him of one crime, tearing down the temple. They convict him of a different crime, blaspheming. And now they're coming to Caesar and say, we want you to punish this person for something totally different that, well, this is the first time we're bringing it up. Completely fraudulent. This trial should have never happened. A complete miscarriage of justice. Now, I don't think this was because of a fickle crowd. I don't think this is because the people kept changing their mind. Much like our society today, you had people that believed in Jesus. You have people that like the miracles. They like being around other good people. And you had people that were very threatened by Jesus. It didn't matter what he did. So they have completely disregarded the law. They have completely disregarded their own procedures. They have come up with a completely fraudulent conviction of an innocent man. That as high priest, as reasonable people, they should have said, there's nothing that Jesus did. So he is wrongly accused, he is falsely accused, and he's crucified. You would think that's the end of it. All of our hopes and dreams, as we said this morning in our sunrise service, all of our hopes and dreams dashed. We thought it was going to turn out so much different. We thought Jesus was going to inaugurate a great new kingdom. He was going to get rid of the Romans. We were going to be great again. Well, as we said earlier, the problem was Jesus was crucified on the day before a holy day, the Sabbath. Now, you can't do anything on the holy day. Normally, they would have immediately put the fragrances on him and wrapped him up. They had to wait an entire 24-hour period. And now they're going to go to the tomb to try to see if they can do that, the last respects for Jesus. Problem: the tomb is empty. Well, how do you explain that? Here's some of the interesting explanations. In the 1800s, they came up with an idea. Oh, Jesus, see, on the cross was just in a coma, the swoon theory. And the guard thought he was dead, but he really wasn't. And when he was put into the cool tomb, the fragrances of the spices, and he kind of was able to recover. Really. So this man was beat, gushing blood from the Roman whips that had pieces of glass and metal in them. His back was just ripped up flesh. He had been pierced in his hands and his feet. Remember the sword that had been thrust into his side that likely went up into the pericardium. And he's going to recover in a cool tomb with those kind of wounds, roll away perhaps a multi-ton rock, and walk 7 miles to show himself to the disciples. Is that really reasonable? That's ridiculous. Okay. How about this idea? He was never really in the tomb. He was just buried with all the other convicted criminals. Well, why would they go to the tomb? Why would there be the evidence of Joseph of Arimathea? Why is an empty tomb such a problem then? Just go get his body from Gehenna, from the place where they threw it. Say, no, here he is. Why do you have a problem with an empty tomb? Well, that doesn't make sense then. No, he was buried in a tomb. One of the sillier ones I've came across in my research. One person said, well, see, it was early in the morning and it was really dark. And even though the women went there when they buried Jesus, they got confused in the early morning and they went to the wrong tomb. Really? So when it's daylight, you couldn't show them the right tomb? And that's what all the confusion is about? Or how about this one? In the 60s, they came up with this explanation. Oh, these people were just hallucinating. They were just hallucinating. The disciples wanted to see Jesus so badly, they were just hallucinating. Really? Everyone having the same hallucination. Okay, people sometimes have things that they think they saw. Why would the tomb need to be empty? Why is that a problem? Just a hallucination. Well, you've got an empty tomb. Hallucination doesn't solve that problem. A real strange one was, one writer said, God gave the apostles visions. Well, that just makes the hallucination seem a little bit better. God gave them a vision. Well, this makes God a trickster. You're giving them a vision to make it seem like Jesus is alive, but he's not. And you still have an empty tomb. That doesn't explain anything. It just makes God look like a trickster. Another really ridiculous one is the disciples paid someone to be an imposter. Really. The disciples paid someone to have crucifixion marks in his hands and his feet. They paid someone to have a wound in his side. They paid someone to have the wounds from the crown of thorns. And nobody was able to recognize that this was not the same person who did the miracles. You find that believable? These apostles that were hiding for their life, who thought they were going to be arrested and crucified next. No, all of these are basically ridiculous reasons. Okay, so what is the response? Well, we read that there's a problem. There's another earthquake. The tomb is empty. The soldiers are now running back to the chief priest and the leaders, and they're saying, now we have another problem. The stone has been rolled away. I'm in Luke chapter 24. These soldiers appeared to be like dead men when they saw the ground shake and the angel coming down. What they've done is they've run back to the leaders, and even though the leaders have heard this evidence, the leaders say, okay, tell everybody you were asleep. And while you were asleep, the disciples came and stole the body. There's a huge problem here. If you were a Roman soldier and your prisoner escaped, you were given the death sentence. If you were a Roman soldier and you were found sleeping on guard duty, you were going to be punished like that. For these men to say, we were supposed to be guarding, but we all fell asleep. Well, there were probably as many as 12. They were only guarding in 2 or 3 hour shifts. They're going to admit to something that could maybe give them a death penalty? Really? And if they were asleep, how did they know what happened? If they'd have said, hey, we were asleep. We woke up in the morning and the stone was rolled away, and we don't know. How would you know what happened if you were asleep? Did the disciples really think they needed to steal the body of Jesus? No, they were disappointed. They thought this was going to be the new kingdom. They were going to get the corner office. They were going to be in charge. What would stealing the body prove? And also the problem, if you were a regular person and you decided to go alter this tomb, what would happen was the Romans would put a wax seal on this tomb. This is an official closed tomb. This isn't like a family tomb. You can't alter that. Anybody seen trying to break that seal, well, they get the death penalty. You weren't even supposed to go there and show any emotion if you did go there. You couldn't show emotion for convicted people like this who were crucified. So you have people coming to a tomb expecting the stone to be there. The stone's not there. And their excuse is, tell everybody you were asleep. This is going to make you liable for a death penalty. We have no idea why the disciples would want to steal the body of Jesus. If they did try to steal the body of Jesus, it's going to take them some time to roll away the stone, to get in there, to get the body. You would think that would have made a lot of noise. Why would they leave the grave wrappings in the tomb? If you're going to break in someplace, you probably want to get out as fast as you can. If they were going to break into the tomb, the last thing they were going to do is, now, wait a minute, guys. Before we run off with the body of Jesus and hide it someplace, let's carefully fold up these wrappings. That doesn't make any sense. What I find absolutely almost unbelievable, except I've talked to people like this, you would think these witnesses coming back to the high priest, we were guarding, we saw brilliant light, there was an earthquake. There might have been an angel. The stone got rolled away, and now the body is gone. You would think the high priest would say, wait a minute. He said he was going to rise on the third day. He's done a lot of other miracles. We still have Lazarus. No one can deny that. Maybe he is the Messiah. No. Even if one is to come back from the dead, they still will not believe. You may have been around people who you witnessed to. You're sharing your faith. It doesn't matter what you tell them. They're not going to believe. This is so tragic. Here are the high priests. They've seen the miracles. They've seen Lazarus. They've seen the evidence of the open tomb. They're not going to believe. And the fact is, they lied about his birth. You remember they said he was born illegitimately. They lied about his miracles. They said, well, you're only performing miracles by the power of the devil himself. And now they're lying about his resurrection. It doesn't matter what proof Jesus gives to some people, they're not going to believe. Well, our conclusion this morning. Is it reasonable? Is it reasonable to believe any of these other possible explanations? Looking at the reasons why Jesus was tried and convicted, this should have never happened. Why did it happen? Because it had to happen. Reasonably speaking, this trial should have never taken place. It should have been invalid. Jesus should have never died. But from before the creation of the world, it was necessary to save us. 15 different reasons why Jesus shouldn't have died, but he did because that was the plan all along. He had to die for our sins. 6 different reasons to try to come up and explain an empty tomb. All of them are ridiculous. The ridiculous plan of the high priest to cover up. Well, just tell people you're asleep. Are any of these believable other than what we have in the Bible? The plain truth. Jesus was here. He was innocent. He did miracles to prove who he was. Some people believed, some didn't. He was fraudulently convicted. He truly did die, and undeniably he rose from the dead. Some people will never believe that. What are the logical results of Jesus defeating death and leaving the tomb? It's a very serious question. Is the fact that Jesus is alive today mean he's just a good teacher? He was just a role model? If the most reasonable thing is to really believe that he was alive, he was crucified, he was dead, but he rose again, what are the results of that type of a series of obvious statements? What does that mean about Jesus today? He rose from the dead. He's reigning forevermore. Not as just a good teacher, not as just a misunderstood political figure. What does that really mean? His kingdom is already begun. And how are you letting that idea change you? Are you willing to let Jesus be the king that he is? Are you willing to let this idea that Jesus rose from the dead truly begin to change your life? Are you willing to let that happen? Or are you going to try to maybe go with some of these odd explanations? And even for those of us who have been going to church for decades, are you really letting Jesus be who he really is in your life today, the one who's reigning on the right hand of God Almighty, who will come in glory and judge the living and the dead? Are you letting him be who he truly is? Well, this morning we've heard some incredible evidence. I've told you some ridiculous explanations that really make no sense. A reasonable person this morning must say, yes, Jesus did live. He was one of us. He was fraudulently convicted. He truly did die. A Roman soldier would truly know the difference between someone who had just passed out and someone who was dead. He even had the spear in his side. And you have an empty tomb that can't be explained any other way. Jesus truly is alive and reigning today. And we celebrate that. But what is that going to do for you? What are you going to allow that to be in your life this morning? If this is all true, there needs